very much. I do want to talk tonight about what my idea of nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to talk about E.O. Wilson's book 2016 called Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. You all know Edward L. Wilson, Harvard emeritus at this point. He's 92, but he still writes a book every year. And this was the book he wrote in 2016. He's getting desperate. He really does want to save life on Earth. And he says in this book, in order to do that, we're going to have to save half of the Earth for nature, or we're not going to save nature on any of the Earth. And that includes us. And he spends most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement.
We're not seeing your screen.
You are not seeing my screen.
Some of us were.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, we were.
All right, let me try it again. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Looks
Okay.
good to me.
Yep.
All right, we're talking about E.O. Wilson. He says we have to save half the Earth, and you know, so many people would love to do that, but they say, how could that be possible? We're already using most of, well, half of terrestrial Earth for some form of agriculture, and everybody else is stuffed in the other half. All 7.8 billion of us, all of our infrastructure, our millions of miles of roads and airports and everything else, and we don't have a third half to put aside. So how can we do that? Well, I think we can do it, and it's what I want to talk about tonight. In order to realize E.O.'s dream, we're going to need a new approach to conservation. And by the end of this talk, I hope you know what that approach will be. Before we start, though, I want to go back to what happened in 2019. We had what we call an oak mast. I believe you folks had it down south, but we certainly had it up here. All the members of the Red Oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. And this is what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it. But I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a hole for its head, forced its head capsule through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze, looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, it plopped down, and this is a very dangerous time for this insect larva because it is good to eat. A lot of things are after it, so it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. Takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber converts itself to a pupa, and then it stays there for 2 years. After 2 years comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. People think weevils have big noses, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down the end of that extension. And they take those mouth parts and chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in it. And that is how the larva gets down there. You might wonder why they spend 2 years underground. Why don't they come out the very next year like most insects? And the answer is it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. So if they came out the very next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Well, once they have left the acorn, that leaves a hole, a true vacuum. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum. So in this case, she has filled it with 3 species of in the holes made acorn weevils in acorns. And if scouts find a new hole, they get very excited because their old acorns falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move. They grab the larvae, they grab the eggs, they move the entire colony into the new hole in about 30 minutes. And then they post a guard here, make sure nobody else comes in. And that's where the new colony will live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point? It's very simple. That is just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions between animals and plants that comprise the bulk of nature. This is another one, the relationship between jays and acorns. Well, jays and oaks. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, fly about a mile from the parent tree, and they tap that beneath the surface of the soil. And the object is to get it during the winter and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they have planted 3 oak trees. And in a good year, they can move, a single jay can move 4,500 acorns. So that's planting a lot of new trees. Or the specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have Facilia. That is the only pollen that bee species can use to reproduce. And it turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. About a third of them can only use the pollen of particular plants. You won't have the Baltimore checker spot unless you have white turtle head. I could spend the entire night talking about nature specialized relationships. But today, these relationships and nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, looked out over the edge, and he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Of course, we can't do that today. We did not leave it as it was, so that's no longer an option. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country, which is 4.5 times the size of Texas. And of course, we've paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We have drained our aquifers, introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated from other remnants to sustain. Why have we done this? I don't know. I suspect we thought the earth, our nest, was that. And that's why we're seeing pretty scary headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one. North America has lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. It is almost a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now the UN says, well, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, possibly in the next 20 years. You know, I was driving today and I heard on NPR that 14 species have just been taken off the endangered species list. Do you know why? Because they're extinct. So this is happening, but I will tell you, it is not an option. It is not an option. We have got to make sure that we do not lose 1 million species, because these are the things that run the world, that support us. We're not going to be here without them. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and this upon all of our houses, but that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people, but those small efforts will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, our friend E.O. Wilson told us what it would mean if Earth were to lose insects, and he did it in this paper way back in 1987, The Little Things That Run the World. And his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants went extinct, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial habitats that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers, and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is good news here, and that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, but we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support systems that nature, that ecosystems deliver to us. So we call them ecosystem services. Here are just a few of the things that plants do. We always say plants do them for us. Yes, but plants do them for everything that's out there, like produce oxygen. Pretty important. Clean water. You know, water falls from the sky. It's plants that clean that water and slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Plants are capturing carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of it. and then pumping the extra carbon into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited there over the eons. Plants build topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. Without plants, we would have to eat sunlight, and that would be hard. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea. $7.8 billion people. We need more ecosystem services today than ever before. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. One of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. There have been indigenous groups that have been good at doing that, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. Well, Aldo had a lot of faith in humans. He believed that we could develop what he calls a land ethic. He knew we had to use the earth. We had to farm and lumber and graze and mine and do all of those things. But he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, but it's still embedded in our own culture. But I'm guessing that Aldo didn't even recognize it as an option. What I want to argue this evening is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that is left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head. We need to save nature, actually reconstruct it where we've dismantled it, where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where are we going to start? Let's go back to private property. If we don't do conservation on private property, we're going to fail. 85.6% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. We can't ignore that much land because otherwise we'll be working in areas that are too small, too few, and too isolated. Now, when I say conservation, I'm really talking about, we do want to conserve anything that's left, but we have to reconstruct the nature that we have dismantled. And I know it won't look exactly like it did before we dismantled it, but that doesn't mean we can't reunite enough of those specialized interactions so that you have functioning ecosystems again. But we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally. So we have to start with the most important species, and there's two groups that we cannot do without. One is the flowering plants and those pollinators that allow them to reproduce. They're capturing the energy from the sun and turning it into food, storing it in their parts, mostly leaves. So now we have the food stored in plant leaves. Well, most animals, most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat the invertebrates that ate plants. And those invertebrates typically are insects. And it turns out that it's not just any insects that's passing the food on to animals. It's typically caterpillars. Any other type of plant eater. If we design landscapes that do not have a lot of caterpillars, we're going to have failed food webs, which eventually will be failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. They, of course, are the birds that are at our feeders all winter long, eating seed, and people think that's what they need. Well, 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seed. The other 50% is insects. But when they're reproducing, their babies can't eat seeds. So they switch entirely to insects, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out that the chickadees are not exceptions. 96% of the terrestrial birds in North America rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. How do I know that? Well, there's lots of lines of evidence that suggest that, but this is a citizen science project that Ashley Kennedy, one of my students, did recently. She put out a call for bird photographers across the country to take pictures of birds during the breeding season and send those pictures to Ashley. She was going to identify the prey items that were in the beaks of the birds and reconstruct the nestling diet for as many species of birds in North America as she could. And you're looking at a summary of what she found. The 20 most common bird families. The green bars are the percentage of the nestling diet that was caterpillars. And in 16 out of the 20 common bird families that you see here, caterpillars dominated the diet. So again, what would happen to bird breeding if we didn't have enough caterpillars? Most of the birds would not be able to breed successfully. So there's something special about caterpillars. Let's figure out what it is. There's actually several things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. So think of this caterpillar as if it's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is exoskeleton. It's cuticle. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And birds don't want a lot of undigestible material. And because they're soft, the birds can stuff them down the throat of their offspring without fear of injuring it. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. The beak is like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, many of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. They are nutritious. They're high in fat, high in protein, low percentage of chitin compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges. And finally, it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mentioned carotenoids not because I like organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids, so we have to get our carotenoids from plants, and we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? From, of course, what they eat. And since they're not eating plants, they're getting it from all of those prey items that they bring to the nest. These first two bars are types of caterpillars, and it turns out they have far more carotenoids than other bird prey items. Here are the adult caterpillars right here. The moths and butterflies themselves, they have far fewer carotenoids because it's a caterpillars that are eating green leaves where the carotenoids are. The moths and butterflies are not. And here is the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others suggest that caterpillars are not optional parts of bird diets. They are essential parts of bird diets. So let's just say birds need a lot of caterpillars. Or let's just say birds need caterpillars. And the next question is, how many do they need? Is it a lot? Is it a few? Is one or two a day enough? Well, let's go back to chickadees to ask that question. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands of caterpillars, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. But they're flying all around, so nobody has counted those. And if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, you have to have all those caterpillars in your yard because they're only foraging about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if you don't have all those caterpillars in your yard, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is directly related to the bird decline that people are measuring. We went to the original data set from Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group that said we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the terrestrial bird species into two groups: the birds that require insects during their life history, typically when they're breeding, and the birds that do not. So things like doves and finches can actually reproduce on seeds. They don't need insects. Well, those birds didn't lose any numbers at all in the last 50 years, but the birds that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. It doesn't prove cause and effect, but it certainly is suggestive that as you take away the bird food, the birds don't do very well. So we need to landscape for caterpillars, for insects, or we're going to lose the birds and all the other things that require those creatures. And that is a new goal, new landscaping goal for our yards. In the past, we have only considered one thing, and that is aesthetics. They have to be pretty. So now we have to find ways for them to be pretty and productive at the same time. So how do we add caterpillars to our landscapes? Well, you add caterpillars by adding the enough, but there is a catch, and that catch is that most plants do not. We have to add the plants that do, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy, and nothing illustrates it better than the monarch butterfly. You can have all the calorie pear and all the boxwood and all the camellias and all the hostas and all of the crepe myrtles, all of those plants from Asia that we typically landscape with, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That's called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Why? Because plants have made them that way. Plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world. And that's why it's green out there in the summertime. It's not because there are no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well protected. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. Every plant lineage that's out there protects itself with a unique cocktail of chemical defenses. And an insect species cannot adapt to all of them. So they pick one or two that are very similar, and they develop the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to those compounds. But it takes a long period of exposure themselves to those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into eating that particular plant lineage. So that's why when you take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace it with some other plant, the monarch doesn't start eating the other plant. It simply disappears. You've taken away the only thing it can eat. It's also why when we bring in plants from other continents, most of our insects cannot eat them at all. So all I'm saying here is that plant choice matters. If we're trying to reconstruct ecosystems, we've got to have functional food webs in those ecosystems. And you have to choose the right plants to comprise those food webs, or it's not going to work. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well it does work when we do choose the right plants, starting with our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. That's what it looked like when we moved in. This was part of a farm that was broken up. It was a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. And the last thing they did before they broke it up into 10-acre lots was to mow it for hay. So very few plants there. Our goal when we moved in was to rebuild the food web on this particular piece of land. And that means I had to bring in the plants that support the caterpillars that food web is based on. So here's some examples. I wanted to attract the Canadian owlet to our yard. That's what Canadian owlets look like. I'd never even seen a Canadian owlet. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. Well, to have Canadian owlets, you have to have meadow rue. That's the only plant that they will eat, host plant specialization. We didn't have any meadow rue. The place had been farmed to death for hundreds of years. No meadow rue anywhere around here. So I got some seeds from someplace, planted them. They grew very nicely. But this was early on, and I actually had very little faith that Canadian owlets would ever be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it. Till about 2 months later, I walked by for another reason, and it was loaded with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. So we've added 2 species to the property. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. Plant Biden's aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any ditch daisy. So I went to, there was a power line cut about 14 miles away that had ditch daisy, and I got some seeds, planted them, grew very nicely. Well, it took a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my ditch daisy. And now we have a good population of both of those. Just before this webinar, I was out front. There's some ditch daisy and there are a couple of goldenrod stowaway larvae on it. So good population of those. Now we've added 4 species to the property. Same story with the hackberry emperor. I wanted the hackberry emperor not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. But like its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, Celtis. We didn't have any hackberry, so I planted hackberry. It took 4 years for the butterflies to find our hackberry, but once they did, we've got a good population. I looked at one of my hackberry branches in June. There were 9 hackberry emperor butterflies on a single branch. Butterfly caterpillars, I should say. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, but along with it came many of the things that depend on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. This is one that hasn't come, the goldenrod flower moth. And it's larvae. I don't know why it hasn't come, but this is part of the fun. This is anticipation. It's like waiting for the ketchup to come out of the bottle. Every year I go out and I look for the goldenrod flower moth. One of these years I'm going to find it, and that will be a great day. I planted Virginia creeper. Yes, Virginia creeper. I hear that people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It makes really nutritious berries for the birds in the fall, very high in fat. It's a great pollinator plant in the early summer. The flowers are not showy. They're little yellow green things, but the native bees love it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the bees, not for you. So they don't have to be showy flowers. They do have to be attractive, though. It's a good ground cover, and it's the primary host plant for the large sphinx moths that are the basis of cardinal diets, particularly when they're rearing their young, like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Wanted to see if I could get the double-toothed prominent at our house, just because it's such a cool looking caterpillar. I mean, even if you don't like caterpillars, you got to like this guy. Well, it's a specialist on elm. We didn't have any elm. It was, wiped out by the Dutch elm disease, but there are 2 big elm trees at the University of Delaware that did not die. So I got some seeds from those trees, planted them, grew very, very quickly. That was 19 years ago. Those trees are now 80 feet tall. And they brought in the double-toothed prominent right away, American elm. Wanted the evening primrose moth because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it. Enithera moths came. They spend the day sitting with their heads stuffed in the flowers. They're very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, these are just examples of the plants that I put in our yard. But I want to focus on oaks for a while. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And that's a problem for some people. A lot of people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if your oak has to be 400 years old before you can enjoy it, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is doing for you in your yard, what it's delivering to your local ecosystem, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or as 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50. And immediately they started to support the moths that run the ecosystems that support everything else at our house, like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, orange tufted onida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the 2-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red humped oakworm, the orange humped oakworm, the pink striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange patch smoky wing, the white blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars of moths have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves of that tree. So you don't have to wait hundreds of years for your oaks to start to rebuild the ecosystem where you live. This is what our house looks like today. We have a little lawn here, so we're very traditional, but I put a lot of plants back. And 4 years ago, I decided try to get a picture of every species of moth that is making a living at our house these days. Remember why I'm focusing on it. If you count the moths in your food web, you're looking at how diverse and complex it is and how well it's supporting everything else. So I started to take a picture of every species of moth. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,136 species of moths that I have taken pictures of right here at home. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So in 1/240,000th of the land mass, we have 44% of all the moth species that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we have recorded 60 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres, not flew by, but bred. Why is that important? Well, this was another statistic we saw last year. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. But I'm thinking, not at our house. I am sure we have increased biodiversity by at least 2/3 and probably more than that. And it didn't take that long. And we did it simply by putting the plants back, which tells me these scary statistics are reversible if we don't wait until these things are actually extinct. All we have to do is revegetate the world in an appropriate way. But I know what you're thinking. We've got 10 acres and a lot of people don't have 10 acres. Will it work in smaller plots in suburbia? That is a good question. So let's go to Margie and Dan Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. And they live in a typical suburban neighborhood. All their neighbors have the big lawns. When they moved into their property, it was loaded with the very common invasive out there, which is Amur honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle. So they got rid of that, and then they put in a lot of native plants, including a water feature they call a bubbler. Up to 149 bird species that have used their yard, including 35 warbler species, including some Missouri state records that have come to their house, have never been recorded in Missouri before. So just to put that in perspective, we've only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? So let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, because right on the other side of that wall there is one of the runways of O'Hare Airport. Right over here is Kennedy Expressway. Pam has 1/10 of an acre. That's 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. And she's not connected to any natural area at all. So Pam's little property is an island. It's a pretty island, but it's just an island. Well, she did the same thing. She got rid of her invasive plants and put in 60 species of native plants, including a water feature for the birds. And then she sat back and started to count her birds in Chicago, and she's up to 120 species that have used her yard, including a woodcock. There's Pam's woodcock right there. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. Are all those people who's out? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, Asclepias tuberosa. People call it butterfly weed, which reminds me, we've got a marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds. And then we wonder why people don't plant them. So let's not call this butterfly weed. Let's call it Monarch's Delight. Now we can plant it. Okay, 2014, I'm staring at Monarch's Delight. And the first thing I saw were 2 species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees. There was a big species and a little species. I know they're leafcutter bees because they carry pollen on their tummies. Well, leafcutter bees have very strict requirements. They're not going to be in an area unless there's pollen and nectar, but also soft leaves. Leaves of red bud are perfect because they cut out the edges of those leaves, leave these little semicircles, roll up the part that they cut out into a tube, and then stuff that full of pollen. And then they lay an egg on that and put the whole thing into a crack or a crevice. And that is how they reproduce. Well, there was a red bud growing right next to Monarch's Delight. So the bees had everything they needed. That's why they were there. They're alone. There aren't any workers. All the workers die in the fall. So when they emerge in the spring, the queen has to start the colony all by herself. So what she needs is access to abundant, very efficient foraging. And that's exactly what redbud provides. It blooms at the perfect time for emerging bumblebees and they get all the nectar and pollen that they need. So there was more than one species of bumblebee there, and I'm sure the redbud had something to do with it. And then I saw a monarch. Actually, I saw two monarchs foraging on monarch's delight. Now, this was 2014. In 2013, that was the low point of the monarch population in the East. Only 3.6% of them left compared to 1976. I had gone the entire year of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. So this was good news. I was excited. Maybe the monarch wasn't going to disappear after all. And this was June, which is very early for us to be seeing monarchs this far north. Why was it there? Well, there was monarch's delight, but there was also another species of milkweed. I think it was purple milkweed. So they had nectar, but they had their host plant. They had everything they needed. You know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, 30 feet above the taxis, right in the middle of Manhattan. The High Line, if you don't know, is it's a renovated, elevated railroad. It had been abandoned for decades, but somebody went up there and there were a lot of native plants growing. Nobody planted them, they just seeded in. So they did renovate it and made it a tourist destination. And now literally millions of people go to the High Line every year. This is Lower Manhattan's shot at some nature, and people love it. This is Rick Dark. He was always after me to go see the beautiful plants on the High Line. I'm not that much of a city boy, so I always drag my feet. And seeing beautiful plants with nothing on them is actually depressing to me. And that's what I thought I would see in Manhattan. I did not believe that a 3-foot planting or strip of native plants, and they're not entirely native plants either. I didn't think they would attract anything, but I was completely wrong. Somebody has just finished a survey of the native bees on the High Line, and they're up to 30 species. So it has proved to me that thoughtful native plants are really powerful. Thoughtful plantings, they can bring life back to the middle of Manhattan, which means we can do this just about anywhere. There are 4 things we need to think about, though, if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of them is we have to reduce the area we have in lawn. We have over 40 million acres in lawn. That's an area the size of New England. And that's a 2005 statistic. So we know it's more than that. Dedicated to an ecological dead space. Lawn is a status symbol. I know we're not going to give up our status symbols, but let's cut the area of lawn in half. The area we keep, we will manicure, we'll still follow all the cultural norms, but we're going to put plants back in the other side. If we cut the area of lawn in half in the US, that'll give us 20 million acres. And we can build a new national park with that 20 million acres. If we do it at home, we can call it Homegrown National Park. How big will Homegrown National Park be? Well, it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? We get the opportunity to develop a personal relationship with the natural world, right where we live, at our own timing, our own pace. All we have to do is go outside. We can avoid crowds. You know, if you go to a real national park these days, millions of other people there. 375 million people went to national parks last year. They were mostly parking lots. It's also free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike. No travel hassles. You get to experience the natural world alone. And I don't know how you can develop a personal relationship with Mother Nature if it's mediated by somebody else. Then it's not a personal relationship. You have to do it alone. And this is particularly important for our kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to Richard Louv. So we're trying, we get 30 kids, and we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour. They go to a natural place. They get out and they walk around. The teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of the natural world right at home, all they have to do is go outside and discover it, learn about it alone. No parental supervision. Let them do this by themselves. What they're trying to do, this is so important because our kids are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't learn why they need to be a steward, how to be a steward, what they should be stewarding, if they don't love stewarding the natural world, they're going to be lousy stewards. and we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Maybe they will learn how to hunt lizards. I am learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives on a very modest piece of nature in Hawaii. So it's a little patch of grass with a hedge, but there are anole lizards there. So she discovered that and sent me this picture to explain how you catch lizards in Hawaii. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks so the lizards don't see you coming. And then you crawl very slowly towards the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress, that's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard. You learn that part of nature. And I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground the rest of her life in her best dress catching lizards. I don't think. She sent me this picture not long ago, so who knows? But I guarantee she's going to remember catching lizards in Hawaii the rest of her life, and I guarantee she's going to be a good steward of the planet. Nature play. Dozens of examples of how to expose your kids to the natural world right where they live. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, it's free, no admission fee. All you have to do is get yourself on the map. What you do is you put in your information for where you live and the amount of area that you're going to be a steward of, the amount of grass you're going to convert to native plants, or you already have converted, or any patch of woods you're protecting. And then your little piece of your county will light up. You will get to see how the other people around you who are doing the same thing. This is our attempt at social media to get for the little. Don't know anything about this, but if we can get them excited through social media to become part of this national movement to build that 20 million acre homegrown national park, maybe we can reach more people. So please get on the map. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to, what plants are we going to put in the area that we're taking lawn out of? Some of those, I'm going to argue, have to be what I call keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. Here's the Roman arch. The keystone is the stone in the middle of the arch. And if you take that stone out, the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone, collapse. 5% of our native plants are making 75% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in your yard as the 2x4s in the ecological house that you're building. They're essential. Your house is not going to stand up without them. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. They're not the only thing you're going to put in your house. You're not done when you put in your keystone plants, but they are an essential start. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, they certainly are. But I can make an all-native landscape that supports very few species, which means it would be a failed food web if I don't use those keystone plants. So the question really is, do we want the native plants that are supporting most of our pollinators and most of our caterpillars or not? Somebody sends me an email once in a while saying, don't you know that ginkgo biloba from Asia actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? That makes them native. That means we can plant them and everything will be great. Well, yes, I do know that ginkgos grew in North America 7 million years ago. We can argue about whether they're native or not today, but I'm not going to have that argument because that's not the metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. It's whether they're productive or not, whether they're doing anything. I don't care if ginkgos grew in the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 species of caterpillars here today, and that is what counts. Country, it's one of our oaks. Mid-Atlantic states, 557 species of caterpillars, over 950 species nationwide. Just to put that in perspective, our tulip trees, tallest, straightest trees in the forest, they're great. They only support 21. So there's huge differences among our native plants, and oaks are the most powerful. By the way, that 1,136 species of moths that I've taken pictures of in our yard, almost 30% of them use oaks. That's why I'm calling oaks keystone plants. If you want to know what the keystone plants are for your county where you live, go to Native Plant Finder from the National Wildlife Federation. website and put in your zip code, and the ranked list of both the woody and herbaceous plants that are best at running our ecosystems will pop up for your county. Here's a typical list for a lot of places around the country. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. They're going to sell me an ornamental cherry from Asia. If I say I want to buy a willow, they'll sell me a weeping willow from Turkey. You got to specify that you want a native member of these important genera, because if you don't plant a native member, it's going to reduce caterpillar use by 65%. These are the top herbaceous genera. Goldenrods are always way up there. The various genera that asters were broken up into, very high. Perennial sunflowers, very high. Just those 4 genera alone not only support a lot of caterpillars, goldenrods support 110 caterpillars, but they also support many of the specialist bees I was talking about. Those 3 genera right there, if you have them in your yard, would give you, I think it's 44 species of specialist bees that will not be in your yard if you don't plant them. There's generalist bees, the honeybees and the bumblebees, will use those plants as well. So by planting these guys, you are supporting all of the bees. If you only plant for generalists, you're going to only support generalists and lose all those specialist bees. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone plants, invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light. And that, of course, is not the goal. There's a lot of research coming out that strongly suggests that light pollution, all of our light pollution everywhere, is one of the major factors reducing insect populations everywhere. These are the ways that lights kill insects. But you know, this is good news to me. We have to turn around insect declines. We can't tolerate it anymore. We've already lost 45% of the insects on this planet. So we've got to turn that around. And if we can do that by flicking a switch, by turning off our lights at night, we're getting off easy. That's pretty easy to do. But I know what you're going to say. I can't turn that light out over my garage or my front porch at night because the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on it so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man doesn't come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. A yellow LED bulb is the best, because yellow wavelengths are not attractive to nocturnal insects. If we switched out our white lights for yellow lights overnight, we would save billions of insects and probably billions of dollars too, because LEDs are a lot more energy efficient. Okay, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to put in Keystone plants. We're going to turn out our lights. Then we're going to invite Mosquito Joe to come kill all our insects. We're very creative in how we can kill our insects. This is a booming business around the country now. Mosquito Joe is spraying everywhere. And he says it's okay because this is a natural product. And he's right. It's made of pyrethroids from chrysanthemums. It's natural. But cyanide is a natural product too. So I don't know if that's a good argument. He also says it only kills mosquitoes. And he's not even close to right about that. I don't know if you remember last year, the headlines, huge monarch kills when they flew through Mosquito Joes during the fall migration, which is right now. Hundreds of monarchs dead on the ground. The big thing about Mosquito Joe is that it doesn't control mosquitoes. You don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You control them in the larval stage. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of the adults, which is really, really hard. Mosquito Joe kills between 10 and 50% of the adults. So he doesn't come close to actually controlling the population. And that's why he has to keep coming back and back and back. And that's why you have to keep paying a lot of money. So let's use something that actually does work. How about mosquito dunks? Get a bucket. People say, how big a bucket? I don't care how big a bucket. Get a bucket, and the bigger the better. Fill it full of water and put in a handful of straw or hay and let it ferment for a couple of days. What you're doing is building up the populations of diatoms and algae, and that is what mosquito larvae eat. And that becomes an irresistible brood to the female mosquitoes in your yard that want to lay their eggs. They will lay their eggs in your bucket. Then you get a mosquito dunk from the hardware store. It costs about $9, and you stick the dunk, just one of those discs in there. This is Bacillus thuringiensis. This is a natural bacterium that kills aquatic diptera. So you put it in and the mosquito larvae will nibble on it, and that's the end of them. But anything else gets in your bucket will be fine. If there's a dragonfly larva in there, it won't hurt it a bit. If a dog licks it or a bird drinks out of it, won't hurt it a bit. It's a very targeted control method. You might put a screen over this so a local squirrel or chipmunk doesn't jump in and drown. But if everybody did this, we would control our mosquitoes very cheaply and in a very targeted way. The fourth thing we need to do is to landscape in a way that allows caterpillars to complete their development. What do I mean by that? Well, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth caterpillar, complete their development on the tree. So the larva eats the leaves, they then spin a cocoon and hang from a branch. Then they emerge as an adult, and then they do it all species from the tree and wiggle their way beneath the ground after they finish growing to pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact our soils to the point where they're so compacted and so hard that the caterpillars cannot get underground. So the way we landscape becomes an ecological trap. If we put in a high quality tree here, the adult moths come in, lay their eggs there, the caterpillars develop, they drop down and die. I am convinced that the way we treat the area under our trees is another major cause of insect decline around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is even less of a viable option. This is what most people do. They have a tree in a yard, and nobody's measured. We're just starting to do this, to measure the in a lunch like this, where you have a tree, you have a layered landscape, maybe a dogwood here, a native azalea, fern, ground cover. This is a safe site. The caterpillars can drop down, the soil's not compacted, they can easily get below ground, spin a cocoon in the leaf litter under here. Survivorship will be much higher. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral around your trees, as far from your trees as you can. And there's less lawn. All of these are safe sites. Use your ground covers, your wild ginger, mayapple, foam flowers, ferns. This is a hotel in Athens, Georgia. These are red maple trees. So any caterpillar developing on those trees will drop down into the fern. It's the middle of a sleep under our trees in order to improve caterpillar survivorship. Another one of my grad students, Desiree Narango, who they graduated at this point, but she did some wonderful work with Carolina chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest there is room for compromise in our plant choices. The question she asked was, how well are chickadee populations sustained in landscapes that are dominated by native plants versus landscapes dominated by those typical Asian introduced plants that we use so much? And the first thing she found is when we look at the introduced plants, they support 75% fewer caterpillars. So we reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Their nest box is up in every yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, well, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. They were 29% less likely to survive. If they did survive, the nest produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. If you put all that information into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native plants in your landscape, non-native woody plants, from none to 100%, this is what you get. We looked at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. This dotted line is replacement rate. That is the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't.
Hello. I'm not seeing screens on if you're sharing them. I haven't for some time. Maybe I'm the only one. I don't know. I hated to interrupt.
What should we do about this?
I can see it fine.
So I would suggest trying to log off and then go watch on Facebook Live.
Or maybe it's because we've exceeded the 100 limit.
See fine.
Click on speaker view, probably up in the top right-hand corner.
Okay, I'm going to proceed here. If we make more babies than adults die, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies, anything below this line, you have a shrinking, unsustainable population. Right here is where those lines overlap, which generously speaking suggests we can have up to 30% of our woody plant biomass in our yards non-native. They can't be invasive. Those are ecological tumors, but things like camellias or crepe myrtles, they're not invasive, or the ginkgo, as long as it doesn't dominate the landscape. So as long as 70% of your woody plant biomass is native, then you can still have a sustainable food web. And I'm excited about this because this is the area of compromise. If my message was you can't have any non-native plants at all, very few people would listen. We love our non-native plants, but remember, it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of native plants. So if we get more native plants into our landscapes, we can tolerate more of these beautiful non-natives. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design, got it this spring. This is a picture taken from a drone 400 feet up. So it's a large garden, and every plant in that garden is a native plant. And you don't get more formal than that. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. I guess that's okay because they're non-native over there. Can we use, can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Just put a fence around it. It formalizes it. It tells people this is intentional. It's not a pile of weeds we forgot to mow. It provides a lot of forage for several species of bees. It's not very big, so we can make it bigger. But if everybody did it, it would help the bees out a lot. And let's remember why we need pollinators. The media will tell you need it because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's really around a 1/12 of our crops. But I don't like the crop argument because people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. You do need pollinators. They pollinate 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we didn't have pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. What about this garden? It's bigger, formal. It's a Drew Latham design. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life that is here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Absolutely, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing program where the state helps homeowners convert some or all of their lawn to appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's called the Lawn to Legume program, very popular. Pennsylvania has started a new lawn conversion program. You get up to $5,000 per acre to convert your lawn into appropriate native plants. There's an island, Florida, where they're paying residents to allow burrowing owls, listed species, to burrow in the front yard. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to be a good steward of that species, rather than fine you if you do something on your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, and Fayetteville, Arkansas had a bounty on Callery pears. You take down a Callery pear, you get a free tree replacement. Even public utilities are getting into the act. In San Antonio, they give you a $100 coupon to put in water efficient native species rather than the water hungry or very thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn conversion programs in the far west, like California, $2 per square foot rebate for every square foot of lawn that you convert to a xeric planting. They do not have the water for lawns. I think we made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. The first one's a serious one. We've come to think of nature as optional. It's fun, we like it, we like to visit it, but we don't need it. And that means, of course, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, which is always, nature always takes a back seat. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and there was this wall-sized poster there. which to me epitomizes our country's view of conservation. We want to save wildlife, save nature, so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for starting the national park system. We're going to save these beautiful places so that future generations can appreciate it. And I get that. It is enormously entertaining, but nature is not there just for entertainment. No wonder we think it's optional if it's just there for entertainment. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation efforts just to the places where there aren't a lot of humans, we're going to fail, because those places are too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we need to run the ecosystems that support us. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And this is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that language because it suggests they're places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to glue our rug back together again, folks, not just to make biological corridors that allow plants and animals to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to create viable habitats where we live, work, play, farm. We're going to do that by putting the plants back where we humans are. For the first time in modern history, we're going to coexist with the natural world. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we did not see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, because everybody on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystem. So why wouldn't everybody share the responsibility of good Earth stewardship? Stan Rushworth, a Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been good at teaching have options to good Earth stewardship. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. Right now, so many people feel powerless. The Earth's problems are huge. And you know, it's very easy to think, what can one person do to turn this around? Well, one person can shrink the lawn. They can turn off their lights. They can get rid of their invasive plants on their property. We didn't talk about that. They could put in a pollinator garden. They could use Keystone species. They can completely revitalize the ecosystem in their yard and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of detract from it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something manageable for each one of us. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about your little piece of the Earth. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you focus. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded, understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as property owners or volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate and then ultimately our own. I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks a lot. I'm done.
Well, thank you, Doug. I was trying to find my unmute button, and I do have a few questions for you that have appeared on the chat box, and I'll try to start with one that I had. I think that was the first one anyways, but you mentioned a goldenrod stowaway that was on a Biden's plant. How does it get a name, goldenrod stowaway, that it's living off of Biden's anyway?
You know, common names are a big problem. Somebody called it that a long time ago. They must have seen an adult sitting on a goldenrod, although you never see them on goldenrod. I don't know how they get these names, but they become formal names in textbooks, and then it sticks, but it makes no sense. How does the morning glory caterpillar get its name? It has nothing to do with morning glory. It's never on it. It's a mistaken identity. And so,
Yep, there's lots of those then. Another question was about what's your opinion about moving trees poleward to avoid the extirpation from the climate crisis? For example, the Torreya tree in Florida.
yeah, there may be specific instances where that's appropriate, but generally I'm against it because if you move them far enough away, you're moving them away from the plants and animals they interact with, which means they're no longer in their appropriate ecosystem, which means they're not going to contribute to it. And so you might save that particular species, but you're ruining its ecological interactions. I think it's more important to maintain the genetic diversity in our plant populations so that they have the building blocks for adaptation. We are throwing a lot of stresses at our plants, and they've got to be able to adapt to these wild climate changes. The other big problem, of course, is that our climate is not gradually warming so that it's actually a benign change. It's becoming very erratic. So even though the average is warming over time, you still get those polar vortexes. Look what happened in Texas last spring. It froze deeply all the way into Mexico. And any plant you would have moved north in that situation would have died. So we're still getting a lot of that variability. So I think in that case, I think it's premature. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And what about nativars? Do they provide as much benefit to wildlife as the natural species?
Well, that depends on the genetic change that created that cultivar of that native plant. That's what a nativar is. So we did an experiment looking at 6 different typical cultivar traits that are in the trade. And the only one that discouraged insect use consistently was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because you've loaded those leaves with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. And we didn't look at flowers, and that's where a lot of cultivars focus, of course. But Annie White at the University of Vermont has looked at flowers, and in that case, the news isn't quite so rosy. When you change a flower trait, you make the petals bigger, you change the UV spectrum of that flower. If you make it a double flower, you're taking away the pollen and the nectar. All these changes can interrupt the specialized interaction that flower has with its specialist bees. The chances of that happening are much, much greater. It's not guaranteed. So there's a phlox paniculated jenna, which was found in Georgia. I believe it's a natural variant, but they cloned it and they're selling it. It has twice the flowers as the straight species. So it gets twice the butterflies. So it's not, it's not a given. But again, most of these cultivars are propagated clonally. So you're putting 0 genetic variability out in the landscape. And that's the part that I do have a problem with, because of that need to have as much genetic variability as we can.
Okay, one person asked about, they must be planting some native plants and observing insects come to the yard, or they were asking if you recommend iNaturalist for recording recovering insects.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great resource that's out there. And if you don't know what you're seeing, take a picture of it and post it up there, and somebody will tell you.
Okay. So I have noticed that we did reach our limit on the Zoom program tonight. I saw that we got up to 69 on the Facebook Live. I'm sorry that some people had some problems with the screen, with the screen share, not being able to see some of the slides. I do have a recording, and I guess I can stop my recording now. But